You rewrote that email 4 times before you sent it. Not because the information was wrong, because you needed it to land without making anyone uncomfortable. Honest enough to be useful, vague enough to be safe.
You sent it, you moved on. And somewhere underneath that, something registered. Not as a thought, just as a feeling. This is just how it is here.
That's not a communication problem. That's not anxiety. That is a trained response to a system that announces it wants honesty, then quietly, consistently makes honesty the most expensive option in every room.
I'm Donald. I talk about workplace behavior, the patterns people experience but aren't supposed to name. And today, I want to name the one running underneath all the others. At some point, you sat across from someone in an interview, and they asked where you see yourself in 5 years. And before you opened your mouth, you already knew the answer that would end the conversation.
The real answer. Financial stability, less uncertainty, work that doesn't follow you home. Those are honest answers. They are also disqualifying. So you said something about growth, about contributing, about being drawn to this particular organization at this particular moment. They nodded. You got the job.
And in that exchange, without either of you naming it, the terms were set. Managed expression in exchange for continued access. You performed belief in the role. They performed belief in the opportunity. Both of you knew. Neither of you said so. The interview is not a conversation. It is an audition where both sides have agreed to pretend it isn't. That is not where corporate dishonesty ends. That is where it is formalized.
Everything after is the same transaction running on repeat. Think about the last time someone proposed something in a meeting you knew wouldn't work. Not a close call, something clearly flawed with a flaw you could name in 2 sentences.
Think about what happened next. Someone said, "Let's take that offline," which means not here. Someone said, "That's a really good point," and the meeting continued as if you hadn't spoken.
Someone said, "We'll circle back on that." And everyone in the room understood, fluently, instantly, without a word of translation, that there would be no circling back.
That phrase isn't vague. It's a complete sentence with a precise meaning that no one is permitted to say out loud. Or you said nothing at all because you'd already run the calculation.
Honest pushback creates a moment. The moment creates awkwardness. The awkwardness gets attributed to you. And quietly, over months, you become someone who struggles with ambiguity. Someone whose executive presence needs development.
Most people at work are not afraid of being wrong. They are afraid of being remembered for it. So you learn the language, the softened objection, the question designed to surface the problem without appearing to oppose anyone, the interesting approach that means its exact opposite.
You learned it because the system demonstrated, without ever announcing it, what happened to people who didn't. And the people who learned fastest got promoted. That's not a coincidence. That's a selection process.
Passion is one of the most quietly coercive words in the professional vocabulary. You've been asked whether you were passionate about the work, in an interview, in a review, in a meeting where the energy needed to lift.
The question sounds reasonable until you hold it still long enough to actually look at it. Passion is what you feel for things that matter to you, independent of reward. Work is something exchanged for compensation.
These are not the same category of experience, but you were asked to treat them as if they were, and you did, because the alternative was worse.
You wrote so aligned on this in a Slack message about an initiative you'd forgotten by the following Tuesday. You turned your camera on during a call that was hollowing you out and performed attentiveness. You sat through a quarterly culture exercise nobody requested, and you participated because not participating reads as attitude, and attitude gets managed. You used the word excited to describe feelings that were closer to indifferent or exhausted or quietly resigned, and you did all of this while knowing, on some level, that the person asking also knew. That's the part nobody talks about. The performance isn't convincing anyone. Both sides know it's a performance. The requirement isn't sincerity. The requirement is compliance with the appearance of sincerity. That is a fundamentally different thing, and a much more corrosive one. Nothing kills genuine feeling faster than being required to perform it on schedule. The role needed filling, The hire made sense. No explanation offered. 6 months later, someone else applies for a promotion. Same credential missing. Now it matters. Now it's the reason. The standard didn't change. What changed is what the standard needed to accomplish. Because inside organizations, there are no requirements. Not really. There are requirements for ordinary situations, for the ordinary path, when the outcome is already yes.
And then there are reasons, constructed after the decision is made, to make a predetermined outcome look like procedure. They are not the same thing. They are almost never acknowledged as different things.
Someone spends years optimizing for the stated requirements, the credentials, the performance scores, the visibility. They do everything the system said to do. And then they watch someone else receive the outcome with different qualifications, or none at all, and conclude that the problem was them. That they missed something, that they didn't do enough. They didn't miss anything. They believed the requirements were the decision. They weren't. They were the language the decision used when it needed to sound like policy. People don't fail the standard. The standard was never what was deciding. And once you understand that, you stop optimizing for the wrong thing, which is exactly why most organizations never explain it.
The feedback systems deserve their own examination, because this is where structural dishonesty stops being abstract and starts becoming personal. You've sat with one, a performance review, a 360 assessment, an anonymous survey.
These are presented as the mechanisms through which truth travels upward safely, where the organization genuinely wants to know what's happening beneath the surface. And at some point, you may have believed that enough to say something true.
Anonymous feedback is anonymous until it inconveniences someone. You may have learned this when the concern you raised in a survey disappeared from the results shared team.
Or when the honest self-assessment that diverged from your manager's perception didn't prompt curiosity, it prompted a conversation about alignment. Or when you gave direct feedback and over the following weeks noticed something shift in how you were treated.
Nothing stated, nothing explained. Just a shift you felt and couldn't prove. What came next was not punishment. Punishment you can name. What came next was more disorienting than that. Your tone became a topic. Your directness became a data point. The observation you made clearly and professionally got reframed, slowly, through the careful language of development and coaching as something you needed to work on.
A gap in emotional intelligence, a communication style issue, evidence that you might struggle in ambiguous environments. Honesty didn't get punished, it got reclassified as a personality flaw.
That is the more sophisticated move, because it doesn't produce a grievance, it produces self-doubt. You stop asking whether the feedback system is broken. You start asking whether you are. And that question is much harder to organize around, much harder to name, much more useful to a system that cannot survive honest feedback but cannot say so. The system didn't malfunction. That outcome is the system working correctly. Most organizations will, at some stage, use the language of family. We take care of our people. You're not just a number here. We're invested in your growth. And you may have believed it enough to let it change how you behaved. Staying later, absorbing more, passing on other opportunities, because you felt a genuine sense of belonging worth protecting. Then someone you knew, 15 years in, well-regarded, competent, got laid off in a restructuring. 2 weeks' notice, a letter expressing gratitude for their contributions, an email from HR with information about returning their equipment. They said family. You behaved like family. They ended it like a contract.
That is not a betrayal of the culture. That is the culture finally visible without the language in the way. The family framing was not warmth, it was extraction. It converted employees into invested participants using emotional vocabulary the institution itself was never bound by. Not legally, not structurally, not in any way that mattered when the numbers changed.
The organization knew the difference between a family and a contract the entire time. It simply needed you not to. Here is the part that is hardest to absorb, and the most important. The people running these systems are not, in most cases, consciously constructing something dishonest. Senior leaders also perform certainty they don't feel.
They also absorb decisions they privately oppose.
They also choose the version of the truth that travels without producing complications. The pressure to perform belief doesn't stop at any level of the hierarchy. It intensifies. But they don't have to be malicious. That's what makes it worse. A malicious system requires bad actors. Bad actors can be identified, named, removed, and replaced with the quiet promise that things will be different now. A structural system only requires incentives, and the incentive here is consistent and simple. Honesty creates friction. Friction creates work. Work creates risk for whoever sits above the friction. So honesty gets filtered, not through policy, not through deliberate design, but through accumulated consequence. Through thousands of moments where someone said the true thing and absorbed a cost that everyone nearby silently noted and privately filed away.
No meeting was called. No rule was written. The culture simply demonstrated over and over what happened when people said what was actually true. And people learned. They always learn.
And once they learned, they taught the next person without meaning to, just by surviving, just by being visible, just by showing what adaptation looks like when the alternative is expensive.
That is how a system sustains itself without anyone deciding to sustain it. Everyone just makes the reasonable choice. And the reasonable choice, made consistently by everyone, produces something that no individual would have chosen if they could see the whole shape of it.
The email you rewrote 4 times. The meeting where you said interesting instead of wrong. The survey you answered with one eye on what was safe to say. The enthusiasm you performed for an initiative dismissed before the slide deck finished loading.
The loyalty you expressed sincerely at one point to an institution that was always going to prioritize its own continuity over yours. None of that is weakness. None of that is a character failure.
That is what happens to people inside a system that says it values honesty, while making honesty structurally, reliably, without exception, the highest risk option available. You didn't become fake. You became trained.
And the exhaustion you feel, the kind that sleep doesn't fix, the kind that follows you into the weekend and sits with you on Sunday evening, that is not from the workload. It is from the performance.
From the continuous low-level effort of existing inside a gap between what you're allowed to say and what you actually know. That gap doesn't announce itself. It doesn't create one dramatic breaking point. It runs quietly underneath everything, costing something you cannot name on any form and cannot explain to anyone who hasn't felt it themselves. The lies were never accidental. They are load-bearing. The performed belief, the manufactured enthusiasm, the managed loyalty, these are not the exhaust of corporate culture. They are the fuel. The system does not function without them, which means it has always known it needed them.
Which means the gap between what it says it values and what it actually requires was never a contradiction it intended to resolve. It was always the point.
The confusion you've been carrying, that persistent low-grade sense that something is structured wrong without being able to say exactly what, was never a misunderstanding. It was the correct response to something designed to be confusing.
And now that you can see what it's designed to do, the weight you've been carrying finally has a name. That doesn't make it lighter, but it means you can stop wondering if something is wrong with you. There isn't. You just learned to see it clearly.